I'm Brad.
I'm Scott.
Welcome to Curiosity.
We're here with Rob Schapiro. Welcome to the show, man.
Thanks. Great to be here. Thanks, guys.
So glad that you're spending a Friday with us. We're like jumping into the podcast here right now, talking about Brad's deodorant conundrum, but
Yes.
we should probably spend our time talking about something that is solvable.
I think so, because this is not solvable. Y'all, it's so sad. Like 31 years of my life. And now I have to
Uprooted.
go look at shelves of stores because Shackley is not available in stores. It's only online. And I just go online, place my order, and 6 show up every week. And now they're
Nothing.
not. It is really rough.
You are a curiosity, I'll just say.
Yeah. I think that's
You've been
I think that's fair.
you've not been preparing for this moment. You don't have any inventory. You don't have a box of it.
Well, you didn't know it was gonna happen. So I always order 6 at a time.
Oh yeah, okay. Just in time.
Yeah. And then
I just adjusted my deodorant game a little bit with it's called Dr. Squatch. Have you ever
Okay.
seen those?
No. I just ordered
I
a
like
new one though last night. What's it
they
called?
have- they've got
I gotta
funny
say,
commercials.
I don't like the sound of that.
No, it's it's like a Sasquatch
Yeah, it sounds-
sort of
it's
thing.
amazing.
Wrong.
Uh,
Doesn't sound like something I'd want to put under my arms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know
haven't
about that either.
Yeah, I don't know if I don't think we're trying to get them to sponsor or anything. So I guess if I talked bad about them, but it's been all right so far. I like the smell.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
But I'm all to say I feel you
yeah. So
get
now I'm
comfortable.
trying different ones. I'm going through the experimental phase. It needs to be natural, as organic as possible with the ingredients.
Yeah,
I prefer unscented,
sure.
but see the one I had, it's a roll-on and it's an antiperspirant, but also it moisturizes.
Okay, yeah.
And so your underarms just feel amazing all the time.
Yeah.
And now it's gone in the universe, which is so sad. They're coming out with a new one, they said, but they didn't say when.
That's awful.
So that's tough.
I have
So
a
I found
subscribe and
Blue
save.
Atlas yesterday.
Blue Atlas.
Blue Atlas was the #1 2022 all natural men's deodorant, according to whatever article I read. And so I
Sure.
ordered that one. It's a little more expensive. And also it was $6 a bottle for this natural one.
Okay.
Also, I got wholesale, but still. And now it's $15 for this other one. That's a lot of money for some
Yeah.
deodorant.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I'm gonna try it. I'll keep everyone posted on the saga of deodorant.
If you've tuned into this podcast, you're probably like me, wondering if you are in the right place.
Exactly. What
You're
happened?
absolutely in the right place.
We are
Okay.
fully off the rails.
All right. Rob, curiosity,
We're here.
life. We are here. I'm so excited.
We're here.
What are you curious about right now?
What am I curious? I'm curious about where this conversation's going, given where it started.
Yes.
And
we should put our hands in 10 and 2 and steer it
steer it back. Yeah. I was excited.
This was intentional.
It was. I was excited about doing this, and I started sort of looking at definitions of curiosity to sort of
There you
get
go.
me going. I'm sure people do
Whoa.
that when they come in here, but there were a couple that I thought were interesting. Two different ones that were interesting. One was a strong desire to learn or know something, and
Like it.
I work at Microsoft, and at Microsoft we call that the growth mindset. And it was actually Carol Dweck, who's a professor at Stanford, who came up with that term, the growth mindset, and it's something Microsoft latched onto. And it's one of the things that drew me to Microsoft was this idea that they're really big on learning and growing as a culture. And Satya Nadella, who runs Microsoft, of course, I'll paraphrase him. He said in an interview, if you have a kid who's got this innate ability, but they're a bit of a know-it-all, and you have another kid who doesn't maybe have as much ability, but they're a learn-it-all, the learn-it-all will always do better than the know-it-all. And I love that. I love that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
That growth mindset. I haven't read the book, but I feel like I've skimmed it, dug into some of the principles.
So, that brings up a really interesting point because I've always thought back to grade school, right? And I don't know that I was the best at rote memorization. I mean, I did it because I had to, but it was more the spirit of curiosity and wanting to learn. And the second that there was this requirement of, which we talked about this a little bit with Digital Divide when we had Melanie on, but this requirement of testing, for example, right?
Yeah.
Because it takes the purity of learning away and puts this false pressure on us that then becomes this requirement. And when you perform well, which means you memorize the information and you regurgitate it onto the piece of paper, then you are quote unquote intelligent.
Yeah.
And if you didn't, then you are quote unquote not.
It categorizes a good intelligence versus a bad.
Yeah,
intelligence.
which is like total ignorance.
And we reward that memorization and the test scores. We reward that. We don't reward curiosity and sort of thinking differently.
Yeah. But that's not
Certainly
learning
not
how
at that stage.
Yeah, not early on.
That's not learning how to learn. That's learning how to memorize.
Right.
Which is probably produces a bit of a know-it-all mindset over a learn-it-all mindset.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
The other thing that know-it-alls tend to get very upset when they don't do well at something, whereas a learn-it-all is okay with failing, and they just see that as a learning experience, right? So it's less stressful in a way to be a learn-it-all as opposed to being a know-it-all.
Where do you felt like you've landed on that spectrum through life, Rob? Like, take us back. Like, when,
I've
like,
been both.
as you've learned
Yeah.
that, like, are there been aspects of that sort of like through your life where it's like you're okay with that, or is that like more of like a recent enlightenment?
It's definitely recent enlightenment, I would say, to think about it in those terms. I've definitely been both of those things.
Yeah.
There's times, I'm sure, where I was a know-it-all and I was annoying, probably as a young, middle schooler. I got good grades, and I'm sure I was a bit of a know-it-all. I was always inquisitive and curious and wanting to learn things. So that I've always had that part too. But later in my career, I think I've mellowed out a bit and definitely been more focused on sort of the concept of, I have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And so I'm listening and learning more than I'm speaking. But that's come later.
I read this really interesting point of view, which we've probably all heard many times, kind of building on what you're saying, right? About leadership styles. And it was a friend of mine who I used to work with. Her name is Kariko. And she posted something on LinkedIn about leadership styles, right? And it was really interesting because it was talking about how the role of, I'm paraphrasing as well, but the role of curiosity is what came to mind for me. It wasn't explicitly called out, but it talked about this kind of idea of how great leaders, right, ask the right questions and sometimes the quote unquote obvious questions. But the other part of it that I found fascinating was like, and when it's time to execute, like they lean in to like make the decision, but they don't lead with the like always having the know-it-all mindset. It's more of that learn-it-all mindset. Yeah. However, when it's time to put on the hat of execution, delivery, like final decision making, like they know the right moment to do that. And I thought that was a really cool point of view.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that, my Microsoft colleagues might not want me touting our competitor Google, but years ago when I was at another company, some folks from Google came in and gave a workshop on innovation, and it was totally eye-opening for me. But one of the things that is related to what you said was that they were talking about how leaders make decisions at Google, and they create a space and an area where they want people to focus, but they don't really tell them exactly what to do or how to do it. They let the people make those decisions and make those choices within sort of an area. And I thought it was an excellent way to lead without, overstepping, without forcing, the direction of the decision. So I thought that was pretty interesting. The other thing that was interesting was the guy came in. There was 2 people actually that came a guy and a woman, and they were doing this in a setting where we were all wearing button-down shirts and slacks, and pretty conservative group of folks in terms of corporate culture. And the guy comes in and he's, wearing a hoodie, and he immediately kicks off his shoes and he's walking around in his socks. And it was just like, here we are, we're in a totally different world right now. And that was sort of pivotal for me in my career, actually, that workshop and thinking about how I could do things differently, even in a more conservative environment. So anyway, I'm going.
Okay, so question on that, right? Yeah. It's really interesting. I have so many thoughts. I'm gonna ask one first and then go to like the serious one. Do you think he did that on purpose, or do you think it was like, was it authentic or was it a little inauthentic?
I absolutely think he did it on purpose, and I think he probably does it every time, is my guess. But it still worked.
Yeah, it was just a way to get people out of context, and it still fit his persona. Because like you can't be inauthentically authentic. If he was being inauthentic about it, y'all probably wouldn't have received it as well. And it's okay that it was shocking and a little off-putting. Like, that's fine, right?
Yeah, it didn't feel inauthentic, but like when I think about it later,
was
knowing what I
disruptive.
know now, I do stuff like that now.
That's
like,
cool.
So I know he did that on purpose.
Okay, now for the other part of the question, which I'm super excited about.
Yeah.
So in that moment, give us a like little bit of deeper insight and like, what was your psychology? Where were you in your journey? You had mentioned you were in a more conservative corporate culture. This Google person comes in, kicks their shoes off. Like, where were you, and like, what did it take to kind of get you to like be more curious about that?
Yeah, okay, so there's a lot here, but I guess first of all, it reminded me of who I was a little bit. It reminded me that I was sort of the type of person that likes to do things differently, always have been. And I got complacent and maybe coasted in a corporate culture where I was there for 17 years. And this sort of woke me up again to say, whoa, you don't have to do things the way you're supposed to do things here. Look at how these folks operate, and they're very successful. Why can't you take your team and have them operate in this way? Things like, giving your folks 20% of their time to work on anything they want that's, going to help the company, but it doesn't have to be related to their day job, something like that. That's the complete opposite way we were doing things. So I started having my team do that. And it was interesting because at least half the people, maybe more, on that team didn't know how to do that. It was like overwhelming to them, and they didn't really want to do that. But the ones who did want to do it, like, they thrived. These were people who had been constrained and could now thrive and come up with these great, interesting ideas that really led to something. So that was amazing to see.
When you've been thinking about innovation and ideas in some of the world's largest organizations, like, always love to go sort of back in time a little bit. And like, is that sort of like, have you known that you wanted to kind of get into that space that or did it sort of happen? What are some of the milestones that got you to that place where you're actually in that meeting and that pivot point? But like, is it always been because you reflect on your childhood and your sort of early education and college experience? Like, is that intentional, or that's been like a discovery along the way?
I think it's a bit of both, I guess, if I was to think about it. I think I've always, like I said, tried to do things a little bit different. But it wasn't intentional that, I'm going to progress in my career to the point where I run a team that's called Ideas and Innovation, or, something like that. That wasn't something I was thinking about because it didn't exist. And so I was sort of more in the mode of, doing interesting work, doing things that I found exciting. And there was some creativity, because being a geologist, there's always creativity in that. It's not an exact scientist, as our engineering friends like to point out. So there is creativity there. But no, I really think that workshop that we had was a pivotal moment for me in a lot of ways. I mean, I was in a job where I was already starting to think about how we could be more effective and how we could serve our internal customers. So it was sort of the first time I'd been in a job where I had internal customers and how we could serve them better. So I was already starting to think about it, and that just kind of clicked it in for me and set me off on a different path.
It seems like there was sort of like an empowerment, or like self-empowered, or was it that they were allowed within the four walls of the organization, and so it kind of seemed like, hey, they're here, it's sanctioned. Like, was there sort of like a freedom in that sense?
Yeah. And kudos to our VP at the time, John Artle, who brought those folks in to talk to us, because it was sanctioned. He brought them in to talk to us. He wanted them to talk to us. So he had the foresight to see that this could be impactful. And so, I felt empowered to not only, attend the workshop, but then do something about it afterwards. And he was very supportive of us pivoting the team and doing that. So it takes leadership for sure. Someone that sees things differently.
I want to double click, if we can, into this, because it's like such a common challenge of like, you're in a big established organization. There's this weight of incumbency that exists of all these processes and other things. And I have this hypothesis that a lot of it is like because of safety. Like, most people grow up in some field environment, or in a petrochemical plant, or in a refinery or something as an early engineer, maybe out in the field, and like safety becomes really important. And so they like build all these muscles and process around like doing things a certain way, but like struggle to pivot then when you get into sort of a leadership role, and you're not able to sort of take that engineering technical skill set that got you into that and then pivot to like effective leadership. And so I guess if I were to sort of like put a question around that, is like what is it that sort of, what are the components to that or the barriers to that now as you try and curate and cultivate that in people? What are some of the things that you've learned and some of the takeaways?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, I think there's that safety element of the culture too, but there's another part of it too in the upstream in the exploration realm. Um, it's been said that it's a oil and gas is a risk management business, and so it's not just about safety, but it's also about the amount of money that you're going to spend on drilling a well, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Is no trivial thing, and so there has to be an element of conservatism. There has to be because it's that kind of business. So I think that also gets ingrained in the people.
So the kind of question you're asking is
Yeah.
what can go wrong
Yeah,
more than
absolutely.
sort of what can go
And
right.
it's much easier to find the flaws. So when you're looking at a prospect or something like that, there's 17 different things that could go wrong to kill that prospect, and so it's much easier to find the flaws. And you often find that happens. And it's a 10% chance of success kind of business. Only 10% of the time are you going to be commercially successful. So it is. It does change your kind of way of thinking about things. You can't fail fast in the same way on a $200,000 well that you can on an MVP of
the cost of
a
iterating
product.
is very different.
It's very different. So, but that said, what we tried to do was think about the individual elements of the work that lead up to those big decisions and how we could do those things differently. So how could we bring in some artificial intelligence to be smarter, to save time, to think a bit differently about those decisions? And also, do we need all of those different pieces of information that we always gathered and spent so much time on? Do we need them all, or do we only need a couple of them? So there were ways that we could start to think differently about some of that work. But and I think, and now, I'm at a different company now. I'm obviously at Microsoft, and it's still a big corporate culture, and there's different things that people worry about. But there's always at a big company going to be, it's always going to be a risk to take things a different direction or to be a bit of a maverick. At any big company, that's going to be a risk that people have to take.
Interesting.
You had mentioned that you've always kind of felt the sensation of this like disruptive type of mindset, even in your earlier days of being the know-it-all. And then it almost felt like the Mr. Deeds effect. I keep thinking about the Adam Sandler movie. I think it's Mr. Deeds. Yeah, and it's at the end
it's like a remake.
when they're in the big room and he asks like, what would your childhood self say to you today? And there was this one guy that I remember this man stands up and he asks him like, sir, like, what would you want to be? Or what do you do? He said, I'm a butcher. And he said, what did you want to be? He said, a veterinarian. And he's like, well, he went a different path than where you had planned on going. But that line has always stuck with me because I think so much about like the way that our childhood shapes our narrative and our reality. And so like going back to like the early days of Little Rob, like what was that like? And why do you feel like that kind of disruptive sense has always just been alive within you? Maybe not always exercised, but always a part of your identity.
Yeah. I don't know. I think I'm a third child, so I think I had more freedom to explore than my brother and sister who, my parents probably spent more time focused on, and I was sort of more free to kind of do my thing. I was a writer, and I like to write fiction from a very early age. So I remember writing my own version of Robinson Crusoe, guy on a deserted island story when I was maybe 7. I don't know, and so I always had that interest. And actually, in college, I was an English major, creative writing major for 2 years before switching to geology, which is another story.
That's awesome.
So that's always been. I've always had more of a creative brain, I think, than a sort of a more analytical brain. And people may think that's weird for a scientist, but I disagree. It depends on the science. And so I don't know. I don't even remember the question. But one thing I'll say, you made me think, what would little Robbie say to himself? And I would have said, spend a little more time in the batting cage. After watching the Astros the other day. I mean, I always wanted to be a baseball player, and I just couldn't quite make that happen. I probably should have spent more time in the batting cage. Maybe.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
That's the life goal.
Yeah.
I love that. I mean, it's funny you touched on something, we talk about it a little bit, is like amongst the creative class, like it's easy to sort of think about like artists, chefs, these kinds of things. But like engineers in a lot of ways like fit that classification because they're creating things, but they're doing it with an understanding of like physics and material science and like the real world, like the constraints of the world. And in so many ways, like that's what chefs are doing is they're bringing forward flavors and other things. And ultimately there's chemistry related to that. Yeah. And so there truly is like this like closet creative in like every engineer that's out there in a lot of ways. And it's a fascinating sort of intersection of things. And
I love the chef analogy because I love to cook and I'm the kind of cook who does not like to measure ingredients or follow exact recipes. That's the creative side of cooking, right? As opposed to a baker that's weighing and measuring and two totally different things.
Right. I am abysmal at following a recipe.
Yeah.
Like Sky has given me recipes to follow and they can be so simple and I am stressed out the entire time. A, I don't get stressed out very easily.
Yeah.
And B, it is not complicated, but the way my brain's chemistry is wired, I just really have a hard time. Like I'm like uncomfortable the entire time. And I'm like triple checking my work the whole time because I'm also like, a total like studious nerd. And so I'm like, want to make sure it's perfect. But if you just give me just something, walk into the grocery store, like Sky is the total opposite. I'm like, I don't want a list. I just want to walk in. I want to see what I see, what inspires me. And I just want to like kind of come up with something while we're walking through the grocery store. She's like, A, that's going to be way more expensive.
Exactly.
And B, are you actually going to cook it? I'm like, fair points, by the way. And once I get over that hump and I show up in the kitchen, I just have these ingredients. I am like, this is my happy place. Let me just throw stuff in and see what happens. And I am not a good cook, so there's that side too. However, it's so much fun to just kind of like explore the flavors of it all.
Yeah.
So beautiful.
One thing I've learned, I think, is we need both types of people in the world. We need the cooks and the bakers and at work especially. You need both types.
I like that. Chefs and bakers. That's cool.
It doesn't work if you're all creatives. And a great example, you do all this work with startups and we've gotten into the startup scene and seeing what's going on at the Ionware work. And often the early days, there's a lot of creatives in these startups, but they quickly realize they need the more analytical, the finance people, the law, all that stuff. That has to come together in order for a company to be successful. It sort of takes both sides.
Well, and like, one important point on that, right? That I really feel like is a point of advocacy that needs to be shared more. Creativity, curiosity, they're not reserved for certain humans. It's not reserved for certain situations. It's kind of like you talk about, I don't know, take something like how we think about innovation, right? And it's like, well, innovation is for these things. It's like, no, like it's a undercurrent that can be interwoven into anything and everything. It's about the way that we see it and the way that we think is so beautiful. And we should all be empowered and encouraged and inspired to like bring our full humanity to everything that we do. And I get there's time and place for certain conversations and ways of interacting, and like creativity and curiosity is universal and it's everywhere, and everyone should feel empowered to embrace that part of their being and like really bring that to life. And it should look different. It shouldn't look the same across the spectrum. Like my version of curiosity and creativity, obviously, like it's kind of what I'm always labeled as, but in the same sense, like I'm also quite strategic in the way that I think. And I have a bit of like an engineering analytical side that comes on when it needs to, because design is very much like a methodical process. And so I don't know, like, I just think that like, it's unfair to label each other to say like, I am this or I am that, but rather just to see all of the ingredients, keeping this analogy alive, like, and like, what can we create together? And I love the idea that like, some people are going to use those ingredients to bake. Some are going to use it to be like the creative chef in the kitchen, or maybe the chef in the kitchen, keep the word creative out. But both are very creative processes. They just look and feel different. They both taste delicious.
Yeah.
Occasionally.
And I was not sure if I was going to close it out, and I totally closed it out.
So,
yes.
So you mentioned something about curiosity being different for different people. So I want to bring up the second definition I found, which was a little bit different, but I wanted to get into it. It was that curiosity is you have an interest in understanding other people's concerns. So took it in a different direction, a little bit more around the people side of things. And that got me excited, because to me, that's really closely tied to allyship. And the way kind of that works is allyship, as you all know, is when someone is trying to understand people that are different from them, who've maybe been marginalized or have been oppressed, and allies. In order to become an ally, usually the first step is curiosity. So you have to have an innate curiosity to understand the plight of another person. And so I thought that was a really interesting definition. I never really connected the two, and it's something that when I, like many other people that are white males or white folk like you all, when George Floyd was murdered, I think it was a tipping point for a lot of us, who sort of reflected on that. And I know for me myself, I was thinking, I need to be doing more. I'm not doing enough. Like, there's got to be something I can do here. And that was, what sort of kicked off an allyship journey for me, specifically in that direction. And one of the first things I did was I signed up to be a mentor with Big Brothers and Big Sisters, and that's been just an amazing experience, with my little brother Jay Sean. But when I was talking about that with some folks at Microsoft, it's sort of funny. You talk about things, you never know where it's going to head. But there's a guy named Roderick Haynes at Microsoft who he was leading the Microsoft Blacks at Microsoft group. So it's an employee resource group. And he said the next day he called me up and he said, "Rob, I want you to become the allyship chair for Blacks at Microsoft Houston. And I'm creating a role and I want you to take it." And I was like, "What? Like, I don't know anything. Like, why do you, I don't, like," I was so like overwhelmed, but I couldn't really turn it down. And so I had to go embark on a learning experience, and I needed to learn, I needed to understand. So, being, a big fan of user design, and you got to go do research. And this is a long way of coming back to the point where I after doing a bunch of research and interviewing people about what allyship is and what it means, I came up with sort of a staged approach to allyship, which was, the first stage was curiosity, the second stage was understanding, and the third stage was action. And so it's cool that we're talking about curiosity, because to me that was something that was so important and critical to getting people into that allyship journey. Sorry, that was a long story.
No, that's fantastic.
It's incredible.
I want to explore it a little bit more, because I feel like there's people are on like a spectrum of their allyship journey, and like you have a lot of conversations around that, like those you just described, these three kind of buckets. And like, how do people sort of, I don't know how the right word is, but sort of like self-discover, or like, because there's a self-awareness that's required in terms of like where you're actually at on that journey. And like, what are some of the questions that you explore and things that sort of help people to find where they're at on that journey, and to kind of find the next active step?
Yeah. So let me start by saying that I am not an expert on this topic, and I'm on my journey. I'm on my allyship journey, and I'm learning every day. So I just want to make that clear. In talking to people and working through the journey myself, I think what I've seen is that most people don't think of themselves as being on a spectrum of allyship. Most people think they're a strong ally, right? I think most people are good and they want to be good to others. But when you dig in a little deeper and start to think about what I can do, you start to realize, okay, maybe I haven't been the best ally. And part of that is in that curious phase is learning and doing some reading. So reading books like So You Want to Talk About Race, or The Black Tax. These are books that you start to read them, and it, at least for me, it was like eye-opening, like, whoa, I didn't understand how deep systemic racism was in this country. I mean, you think you do, but you don't. You start to read a book. The Black Tax is really interesting. It gets into all of the sort of financial handicaps, I'll call them, that have happened over the years, or hindrances that have happened over the years to Black folk in this country, and what that's led to today. But what I love about that book is it doesn't just talk about what's happened. It talks about how do we get out of that, and how do we go forward. So it's a great book. I encourage people to read it.
Actionable insights.
Actionable insights for people to take. And so, for example, it talks a lot to Black people, saying, you need to spend your wealth on Black-owned businesses, right? And that's really important. But why can't I? I'm a white guy. Why shouldn't I be doing that? And so I refinanced my mortgage, and I found a Black-owned mortgage company, right? These are things that are material that we can all go and do, that are actionable. So anyway, going back a little bit, it's learning and reading, and then having some discussions. And we started a book club, kind of jokingly calling it Bam Bam, which is Blacks at Microsoft Books and Movies Club. And it was a group of allies getting together and talking about these books that we would read, or watching a documentary or a movie like Selma, and then getting together and talking about it, and teaching each other, and not relying on our Black friends to teach us everything. Like, why should they have to teach us about what we did to them in the past? So by doing that, you start to see other allies, and they start to have these awakenings themselves, and they're like, you see it dawning on them, like, oh yeah, and they're starting to get it, like, okay, here's some things I can do. Because I'm sure it's always feeling overwhelming. It's such a big problem. How can one person, make a difference? But I think you have to just say, well, I'm going to make my difference here. I'm going to mentor this one boy.
Going to lift where you are.
Yeah, do that one thing. And if we all do that, change your mortgage company, things like that. Go to a different restaurant. Come out and see Dawn Burrell at Late August when she opens at the Ion. So there's a little plug for Dawn.
That's going to be awesome.
Yeah.
I'm so excited about that. I mean, all the yes, and I'm just like so inspired by what you just shared, because it's so true. Obviously, there's very real systemic racism in the society that we exist within. And there's so much opportunity to have conversation around these complexities and these realities of people's lived experiences. And what I would encourage all of us doing is, instead of constantly being your own barrier and trying to disprove what people's lived experiences are, be curious, ask questions, read some books, learn other people's points of view, as opposed to what I hear in certain environments is kind of like you said earlier about the corporate landscape. It's like we're spending more calories and energy on what's wrong or why I don't agree, rather than like what could be better and how could I think differently about this. Put our onus on ourselves. I feel like that's one of the first places of allyship to happen, because no matter what we think, there is absolutely things that we do not know about ourselves. And we have to be comfortable getting under the ice cap of our own humanity and identity and exploring that. I think is like one of the very first steps in order to even remotely begin to possibly understand a topic this important, like humanity's big, beautiful priorities. Like, this is like number one on my list for every reason, because it matters so much. And we just did this incredible, I was super fortunate to be a part of this incredible DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion project here in the city. Got to work with some rock star humans. And to your point, like locus of control. And so I stayed within locus of control, and we've been working on this for about 2 years, just kind of like sweat equity, putting in time and energy and calories around a DEI study strategy that was done. And then we finally were able to take all of those insights and actually do some real work around business support organizations and minority and women-owned businesses. And it was so incredible to think about how the most simple things could go such a long way. So one of the things that I've learned happen with MWBEs and with BSOs is, that's the short terms here, is that oftentimes what happens is, think about it, you're just like a small organization somewhere out in the universe, it's minority owned, it could be women owned, and you're like a construction company. I mean, whatever it is, right? You're a law firm. It's irrelevant what the business is. It's what they call the Main Street businesses. There's some tech and innovation in there and startup for sure, but it's more about like these kind of Main Street businesses. How do you even know who to talk to then engage with a big brand who has a DEI focused procurement program that you don't actually know exists, or even, and it's like really intimidating as a small, I remember being in a small brand, and it is very intimidating to go to the big brands until you've been in them or you've been around them.
Yeah.
And so like, not only is there the systemic aspects, but also culturally, there's a very real fundamental reality of just access and exposure to these realities. So what the BSOs do is they provide that access and exposure to them WBs to say, hey, did you know that this big brand, whoever it might be, has a DEI focused procurement program that will award minority and women-owned businesses contracts to do work with them, even like, yes, you're a construction company and you're small, but they're looking for you. Like, and the first question is like, wait, what? That's like a thing? But there's such a gap in knowledge in that. And so what we did is we aggregated all of that data and centralized it so that the BSOs had the ammunition to then hand that over to the MWBEs and connect the right dots. I mean, like, and it was just like the coolest moment because you're talking about locus of control and like you actually have an opportunity, something that seems so simple, like just having access to information, but yet so important to be able to create those connections and those collisions. And getting really nerdy, I was excited about it because we used a design-led approach to build it all out. And so it was also like aesthetically really beautiful, really easy for users to navigate and like really intuitive. So that was also really cool.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the things you're talking about is important in the sense that like we're not starting from a place of neutrality. Like there's decades and hundreds of years of sort of behavior and like this weight of incumbency. Right. So like by actively making and addressing these issues, making available information and addressing these issues is critical. It's not just going to sort of like take care of itself. Right. And so that's where sort of like neutrality on the topic is the same as sort of like perpetuating the status quo. And well, Brad and I have had these conversations a lot. I'm really excited that we're talking about it here on the podcast because we really haven't had an opportunity yet. And as Brad's touched on, it's been one of the kind of these big, beautiful areas that we've talked about because one of the underlying premises of curiosity is in this like divided world on like all sorts of different topics is that we take this sort of like quick split decision take on, you know, Twitter and TikTok videos and other things. And we sort of have lost our critical thinking capabilities and our ability to kind of ask questions. And so I like to say that like the precursor to unity is curiosity. And that's like, I've been saying that like from the very early days. And here you are telling me that like through all of your research that like the first step is curiosity.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's fundamentally why we started the podcast was to get curiosity reinvigorated back into society. And one of the primary reasons was looking at the systemic racism that exists in our society. And that was one of our top 3 reasons. That was our number 1 out of the 3, because it's so incredibly important. Like, let's ask each other questions. Let's explore together. Let's grow together. Let's build together. And by asking questions, and it can't be the cynical questions. It can't be the I already have my mind made up, disprove me way of questioning, because that's not what we're speaking about here. Right. It's that humble swagger of coming in to say, or even just put the swagger aside for a moment, just having the humility and the wherewithal to say, I don't know what your life is like. And just to recognize that for yourself, not for someone else. Like you made that comment earlier. This isn't about like, oh, teach me. No, it's not anyone else's responsibility to teach me. I need to figure that out on my own. And we can ask questions and have conversations and discourse and dialogue without being so polarized and tribal in our thinking.
Yeah. And I think, you know, everybody has hardship in their life and things that have been hard. And I think sometimes people think, well, I've had it hard too. And what people need to realize is that regardless of what's happened in your life, you have some sort of privilege. Whoever you are, you have some type of privilege. It may be the color of your skin. It may be that you're a man and not a woman. It may be that, you know, your gender identity, whatever it is, there's some privilege that comes along with that. And so it's really important. I know people get worked up about that word, or they get scared of saying they have privilege, but it's so important to own your privilege, I think, and realize that you have it. And the other thing I was going to say is it's hard to have these conversations, and I think it's probably hasn't come up because we're 3 white guys sitting around talking.
Exactly.
And it's not, you know, we're not experts in this. And so it's hard to talk about it. And somebody out there will say, oh, they shouldn't be talking about that. But as long as we acknowledge that we don't know everything, we don't understand the experiences, but we're trying and we're trying to learn. I think it's the intention is to be better. And you will make mistakes. Allies will make mistakes. I've made mistakes. I've done the wrong thing or said the wrong thing. And what's important is what you do after making the mistake, and how you learn from that mistake, because it's hard. It's hard.
That failing forward, but sort of having the courage to at least like embark on the journey. And like you're saying, like we're all coming from a different starting point and have sort of different backgrounds and experiences, but there's this weight of history that predates all of our, you know, showing up on the scene. And so it's like, what is it that we can be doing to add to that? And so I guess like, where have you seen kind of the biggest, I don't want like improvements or like steps in that direction that seem to have like the highest hit rate of like people discovering for themselves, or is it really quite incremental, and or are there sort of things that you've seen that it seems like accessing, different content and media and from an education standpoint, but are there other things?
Yeah, there are. I mean, we have these employee resource groups, and most companies have them.
Sure.
And it sometimes seems like a group like BAM, Blacks at Microsoft, is for Black people only, and so folks like us will be like, well, I'm not going to join that because I'm not part of that group. When they invite you in to join that, what we call BAMily, because it is like a BAMily at Microsoft.
That's amazing.
When they invite you in, it's really powerful. Because then you see, oh, they actually want someone like me there, and they want me to learn and advocate for them, and that's been huge. I mean, that's my closest relationships at Microsoft are probably with that group. Actually, not my work team, but probably with the BAM team. So what I've seen from other people is we just have to invite them in, let them know that we want them to be a part of this. That's huge, and then people start to dig in and learn. That's been big. The book club was really helpful. It's hard. It's a lot of work, but and it was generally small groups. And the idea was hopefully that small group, each person would then go off and share what they learned with other people, and you'd grow it sort of organically. But it's definitely like one of these things where it's sort of like you feel like you're having small improvements here and there when it's in terms of trying to grow allyship. It is challenging, and part of that is there's so many ways you can be an ally, right? To different groups, to different situations, and we want people to do that. It's really hard to be a strong ally to everything. Of course, in your mind, you might feel that way, but to actually take action on every one of those things, you wouldn't have time to do your job. And so I think people will focus on different areas, and I think that's totally fine and normal.
That's a really good point. Like, I think back to the earlier days when we were building 900 pounds, and I was getting a lot of exposure in the universe, and so I was on, I mean, every time I got asked to be on a board, I just said yes, because I just felt like so privileged, to your point about privilege, that I was even being asked to be on this. And so I just said yes to everything. And so I turn around a year later and I'm on like 12 boards. And so I finally realized, like, hey, it's not good for your relationship with your significant other, because Sky's getting way less of my time, which is also a priority I need to be mindful of. And I'm ineffective at that point because I'm stretching myself too thin, as the saying says. Right. And I'm giving a little bit of energy to each one. And so my kind of re-engineering of that was, I want to say yes to the right things that I'm most passionate about, and learn to say no to the other things, which is, I have a very hard time saying no. I actually told one of my team members, 2021, I said, okay, we're going to use 3 words this year: yes and no. It's when to say yes, when to say and when to say no. And this was a moment where I needed to say no to a lot of things. And they were all great causes. Like every single one was a phenomenal cause. Like there's one I still to this day have such a passion for. It's my profile picture. It's "This tea empowers a girl." And for anyone that's listening, please go to Girl Start, go to the Empower campaign. It's $100. You buy a t-shirt, sends a girl to after school STEM programming for a year. It's an amazing organization. They do a lot of other stuff too. But it's like, that's an easy way to make an impact on women in STEM, especially young ladies, K through 12. But at some point, I had to say no to the things that even I really enjoyed and start saying yes to the right things. And that was one. At a certain point, it was time for me to say no, which even saying it now is so hard. But I did it for years, and eventually I was just like, but when you're doing 12 different things, like, it's just not. There's
trade-offs.
It's
you can have a bigger
impact
ineffective on a few things.
Yeah, so I'd rather be rocket fuel than fireworks. I mean, I want to be fireworks too, but I want to be both.
We've taken that same approach with our community, our community engagements at Microsoft in Houston. Is that everybody wants us to be involved in everything, and so we've really kind of focused in on four initiatives that are all in some way or another related to technology and innovation and women and people of color, right? And so actually very similar to, what was the organization you mentioned?
Girl Start.
Phenomenal
organization.
Yeah, so there's another organization that's probably very similar called Supergirl Shine Foundation that we're involved in, and we ought to connect the two organizations. But they're doing this amazing work with girls that are interested in STEM, and it's all tied to curiosity. These are girls that are curious and want to learn more, but they've always felt like imposters, and they're not supposed to be doing this stuff, right? And this is all about teaching them and encouraging them and getting them involved and excited. So
we've mentioned a few resources. We'll put in the show notes, links to some of the books, or it'd be great to just sort of provide kind of a library of resources. There's one that I know is on our shelf of the house about something like how not to be a racist or something like that.
Yeah.
And
Yep. That's a good one.
authors
cool.
on Instagram, I think.
Yeah.
And
I have a list of, I don't know, 50, 60 books I can share with
boom.
y'all.
That's yeah. I think it'd be awesome
Something
to
for
sort
everybody.
of like make some of that available
Please.
so that it's actionable. You know, I think that's something that we're.
The other thing I'll say to the listeners maybe that's actionable that they can do is if you're on LinkedIn, diversify your LinkedIn. I mean, if you go look at your LinkedIn right now, I guarantee you the people on your LinkedIn look like you.
And over time, a curated group of
actually
people.
consciously think about diversifying your LinkedIn. And when you do that, then your feed changes dramatically. You start to see all these things that you weren't seeing before. And it's really interesting and empowering. And also when it comes to hiring people for jobs and things like that, you'll have a much broader network to pull from and you'll be able to hire more diverse folks.
I like that.
That's awesome.
Super cool.
You know, I think as we're kind of wrapping up, there's 3 words that feel like they've kind of just been percolating throughout the conversation. And this is like all around the factors of allyship, but access, exposure, and resources. These are 3, I think, fundamental principles that are very important. I've learned through just my own journey in being able to get to a point of outcome. And then it's about kind of what you were talking about a little bit earlier, like, is it improvement? What is it? I mean, I really do believe it's advancing big, beautiful priorities. And in this case, it's advancing DEI big, beautiful priorities because they're so incredibly necessary and important. And like the outcome of that, the hope is that it's a very beautiful outcome and it just creates a more equitable society and all of the factors that are required to do that. I mean, it's across every system that exists in society has an opportunity to be more equitable, be it banking, be it energy, be it culture, be it art. Every system within society has that opportunity and that privilege to be able to think differently about ourselves. So regardless of what industry we're in, whether we're the baker or the chef, it really is. It's so important that we all think about what's in our locus of control that we can impact. And so we like to close out each episode with a question in season 2.
It's time.
And so I think, and we make these up on the spot.
Yeah, we don't know what it is, so we're going to make it up. Ready?
So let's all riff on it. I think the question is something along the lines of like, what is the next best thing that I can do around, be it diversity, equity, and inclusion, being an ally, regardless of who I am? What is the next best thing I can do? Does that feel right?
Yeah, it's like, where am I at on that kind of ally journey?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I would say, and again, I'm not the expert, but here's Rob's opinion. It's first figure out where you are. Where are you on that? Are you in that curiosity stage? Are you in that stage of understanding? Are you already taking action? And then think about how you get to the next stage. So if you're in the curiosity stage, what's it going to take for you to really get that deep understanding? It's really learning and talking and reading. If you're trying to go from understanding to action, it's what is the thing you want to focus your attention on. You take that precious time you have and pick that one thing you're going to go out and do. And actually, is it I'm going to diversify my LinkedIn, or is it I'm going to mentor someone, or I'm going to join one of these organizations you heard about today and see if I can be a mentor. Reach out to Div Inc. and see how you can help. So
shout out to Div Inc. For sure.
Yeah. So there are lots of ways you can get to that final stage of action, which is it's not a final stage. I mean, we're all still growing.
Sure.
But that's where we want everybody to get to.
Yeah, get to the ever evolving stage.
Yeah.
And yeah, I love that. That feels very interesting. And I think the other important point as we're rounding out, it is really necessary to remember, like, moments build momentum that create movements. And we have to start with the moments. Like, I think we always feel like we have to go straight to the movement. Like, we have got to be at scale. This thing's got to be totally in its purest form of awesome. But we don't get there without moments and momentum. And so I think it's like, don't be so overwhelmed by a cause that you're passionate about by thinking about the movement. Just focus on the moment and do the next best right thing. So in the moment that you are in, what is the next best right thing that you can do?
Love that.
Awesome. Rob, thanks for being here
Boom.
with us.
Thank you.
This was great.
Enjoyed
Boom.
it.
Boom.
Boom.
Thank you for listening. Join Brad and Scott next time on the Curiosity Podcast.